This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast, part of the Seneca Network from Sup China. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I'm your host, Jared Turner, longtime resident of China, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series. And if you think nobody cares if you're alive, try missing a couple of credit card payments. My co-host is John Pasden, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese grammar wiki, sinosplice.com, and to the thief who stole his iPhone, you could FaceTime. Have you ever had questions in Chinese about your weight, how much money you make, if you've eaten, or just a general lack of please and thank yous? John and I are going to talk about common usages of Chinese that often can be perceived as rude by non-native speakers. Plus, we're going to talk about how you can avoid being perceived as rude to Chinese speakers. Interviews with Randy Telfer, who was first drawn to Chinese by martial arts and today has built his life and career dependent on his Chinese skills. All this and more, let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner joining you from Utah in the United States.
Hi everybody, my name is John Pasden and I'm in Shanghai, China. How is everybody?
All right, John, are you feeling rude today?
I'm always rude, I'm sassy.
All right, well that's perfect for today's topic because we're going to be talking about how rude is Chinese.
Is Chinese a rude language? All right, that sounds ridiculous. I think, every culture is a little different, and sometimes that results in people seeming rude when really you just don't know the cultural norms. So we're not talking about, behavior. We're talking about language.
That's right, because, the language, it's very different. You're learning Chinese out there, but we're going to talk about some real specific things that many people may perceive as being rude.
All right, so if you've been learning Chinese for a little while, but you've never been to mainland China, or if you, your Chinese is quite good and you kind of know about this stuff, but maybe you don't think about it much, we're just going to give you some stuff to think about.
That's right. Some aspects do border a little bit on the cultural aspect, but we're really going to be sticking to more of that language. All right, so the first thing we always like to bring up here is nosiness. So like poking, prodding, asking very personal questions in Chinese. And if you've been in China or maybe you've met some people that straight from China and you're talking with them, this can happen in English as well or whatever your native language is that they can ask some very direct questions about your personal life.
Yeah, so basically if you've ever taken a taxi, then you've probably been asked some of these questions. So they want to know what your job is, how much it pays, your marital status, whether or not you have kids.
Do you own a house?
Things like that. And it seems, if you own a house, how much it costs. It seems like a little bit much for a first meeting. And maybe some of these questions are starting to become a little less common these days because Chinese are becoming more aware that foreigners might not appreciate that kind of question. But you shouldn't be too surprised if it happens and don't think you're talking to the world's rudest person.
Yeah, it's pretty normal. Yeah, and one I think that always kind of threw me for a loop, and many of my other friends was that, how much money do you make? It's like, well, why do you want to know? Like, why would you start a conversation like that? But it's really common. And in fact, it goes back to this funny shirt that was been around the internet. This guy, he has this shirt printed off in Chinese. It has like answers to 5 questions. The questions aren't put on there, but just the answers. It's like, America, 24, no, yes, and and I'm not married, something like that. So it's like the replies to the most common questions that you always get in China.
So that one didn't include his salary, but that is something that you will sometimes be asked. I feel like that one is kind of disappearing a little bit because people realize that it is a little bit too nosy, but you might get it. And one thing that people don't realize, I think it threw me in the very beginning too, was that you don't have to answer the question and you don't have to refuse to answer the question. You just kind of laugh and be like, oh, I get by. You just come up with a vague way to answer that isn't confrontational, right?
That's right. And I think this is the good first tip to dealing with many of these issues we're going to bring up is that you don't have to answer the questions, right?
Yeah, they're just the little small talk conversation starters.
Exactly.
Okay, so just now those nosy questions, those are usually people you don't know, which is what makes them so surprising. But then the people that you do know, when you run into them, they don't usually ask, how are you? They ask, 你吃过了吗? Have you eaten? 你去哪儿? Where are you going? And those two questions people are sometimes bothered by as well. It's like, well, why do I have to tell you about my eating schedule or where I'm going right now, right?
That's right. But truly, these are actually just kind of like greetings. It's kind of like saying, hey, what's up? Or, how are you doing? And I will say that there are some regional variances in this. Some areas will say that more than others. So you may not get that depending where you're at or who you're around.
And some people might make a habit of always asking you where you're going. But again, this is kind of like the other one. You have to know how to answer these questions. So when they ask you if you've eaten, you've just always eaten. Just don't think about it. Because if you haven't eaten and it's like past lunchtime, then that's a whole conversation you don't want to have, right? And then when people ask where you're going, you're just going out. Like, this is what Chinese people say too. Just going out.
Yeah. 出去啦.
And that answer, that answer is actually fine, which is kind of hilarious because, like what Jared just said, the question isn't really trying to get information. It's just a greeting.
It's someone comes and say, hey, what you doing, man? How's it going? Oh, it's going fine. They're not really saying like, oh, I've got indigestion right now and, and I've got this big project I'm working on. No, they're not asking really. They're just like, it's going fine. That's standard reply.
Okay, now, Jared, I want to share something that's kind of different. This is something that I ran into, which is a linguistic issue. Back in my days in Hangzhou when I was a teacher, and I would have students occasionally tell me that they couldn't make it to class. And naturally, if someone can't make it to your class, they're going to tell you why, right? And their answer for not coming to class would be 我有事,
yep.
Which literally means I have something.
The infamous 事 or 事情, right?
A thing, an affair, a matter to deal with. And at the time, I was just like, what kind of reason is that? Like, something else is more important than my class? And I was imagining them like playing video games or I don't know, just not coming to class because they don't feel like it. When actually there probably was a thing, like maybe they're going to the doctor, maybe they're attending a funeral or something really serious. But, for whatever reason, in Chinese, you're allowed to say that. Like, you don't have to give a specific reason. This is a cultural norm. And I didn't realize there's a cultural norm. Like, we Americans, we feel like we have to tell someone why we can't come to their party or why we can't do something. And if we don't have a good reason, we make up a lie. Whereas in Chinese, you just don't have to give a reason.
It's just totally true. And this took me a while to get used to as well. My wife and I were like, something like, oh, 我有事, like I can't come or whatever. And like you said, we want an excuse, we want a reason. It's kind of like, I think at least in our Western world, it's like we want to kind of preserve, good relations and make it look like, it's totally impossible for me to come or participate in this because, that this thing happened or I have this prior obligation, so it's nothing against you, it's I have this other thing happening. But yeah, in Chinese, 事情, right?
Yeah, I think we see giving a reason as like an indication of sincerity. So not giving a reason is like insincerity. So it's kind of infuriating, but you just have to like chill out and realize it's a different cultural norm.
So one thing you can take away from that is that, because that's a very common response, just, I've got a thing, I got a 事情, 我有事, right? And you just be very unspecific. But the same thing when, we come back to the examples we had given just a little bit ago, like, 吃了吗? 吃过了吗? 去哪儿? You don't have to be specific. It's just, you can be very vague, very general, and that's totally okay. Because it's kind of interesting, John, right? Is that, Chinese people can be very friendly in general. They don't really probe into your own personal life. Now, that's a little contradictory for how we're starting out here. Like, how much money do you make? Are you married? How old are you? Things like that. They're commonly asked those of foreigners, but, even sometimes work colleagues know very little to nothing of the other individual's personal life.
Right. And then, so I think you were just saying this, Jared, when the time comes and you can't attend something, you don't have to give a reason. You can use this too. So this works both ways. It's not something that you're going to be able to naturally just pull out the first time, but once you get used to it, it actually becomes kind of convenient.
Absolutely.
All right, so one thing that I remember my Chinese friends were telling me a lot when I first came to China was that I was super polite.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom raised me to be a polite boy, so I am polite. So it's like, yeah, thanks for noticing. But what I didn't realize was that they were saying that because I was saying thank you for everything, especially like services, like a cashier at a grocery store or waitress bringing me a napkin or something. And it kind of amuses Chinese friends because it's not bad to say thank you, but to them it was just a little much.
That's right. And sometimes you will hear Chinese people that might say, "Hey, you Westerners, you foreigners are so polite." But yeah, we say please and thank you quite frequently, and that's just not as common in the Chinese language. So, for example, I think John, the example you gave is like a cashier. They give you your money back, and you say, 谢谢. They might be like, "Why are you saying thank you?" In some of the there's a lot of cultural things baked into that. But it's more like, I'm just doing my job. This is my job. You don't have to thank me for doing my job. It's just normal, right? That sometimes that can be one perception, from the Chinese perspective. But the pleasantries are not as commonly used as we do in the English world.
And in this case, it's not really going to negatively impact you too much if you thank people too much. They're just going to think you're polite, maybe chuckle a little. But the thing you have to be careful of is seeing other people not saying thank you, like Chinese people, and then judging them. Like have you ever heard this saying like, "Oh, when I go on a date with a guy, I know what kind of person he really is by how he treats the server." You've
Yep.
probably heard that before. But if you see your Chinese friend not saying thank you to the person who brought him a napkin, that doesn't make him a bad person. It's a different cultural norm, and they just don't say thank you quite as often as we do.
So I think a great way to think about it is just you give, and if you ever have been offended or had felt, I don't know what, like it wasn't polite or proper, if a Chinese person was behaving or not expressing gratitude in those ways, give that a pass. Frankly, just give it a pass. Like that's a cultural norm, and recognize that if you are saying thank you or please quite frequently, let them know that is not the norm, and that is one reason why a lot of Chinese people might think that foreigners are very polite, because that's just what's normal to us, but it's more of a cultural difference.
All right, and there's one other thing I want to mention because it's been such a big part of my own China experience, and in fact, we have a podcast from, I guess, years ago about language power struggles. Mm-hmm. Remember that, Jared? So I always used to feel very offended and feel like it was so rude because Chinese people wanted to speak to me in English and didn't want to speak to me in Chinese. And, I came all the way to China specifically so I can learn Chinese and talk to people in their own language. And why is everyone talking to me in English all the time? So this used to drive me crazy.
That's right, because they're trying to use you for conversation practice, right?
They're using me. But one thing that I didn't appreciate at the time was that I come from an immigrant nation. So in the U.S., it's the opposite, right? When someone comes to the U.S., we expect them to speak English. Like, we don't care how long they've been there. You need to speak English, right? And so I kind of unconsciously expected the Chinese to expect me to speak Chinese, or at least to be like, "Oh, good, you speak Chinese. You're not one of those foreigners that don't speak Chinese," or something like that. But it just wasn't like that at all.
So, John, how did you get over this?
Well, I think one thing is you got to remember everyone's different. So there are definitely plenty of people that really want to speak English, and you're probably not going to be able to speak a lot of Chinese to those people. But there are plenty of Chinese people that don't care about English, and they're happy to speak to you in Chinese. They might not be the youngest or the best looking, but there's still plenty of them, and there are plenty of chances to speak Chinese. So I just kind of had to learn to pick my battles and to remember that this is not an immigrant nation.
That's right. And you know what? Frankly, sometimes it's nice to have a little break, right? Or one other one is the directness of the language, all right? Sometimes this can be perceived as rude by us foreigners. And specifically, one that comes to mind is people saying you're fat, right? That's not uncommon, right? "Oh, you're looking a little fatter, 你胖一点," and you even there's like nicknames. If you heard, Xiao Pang, right? Someone say little fat, little fatty. I guess would be a translation. That in Chinese language, though, that's not really perceived as being rude. It's just more of like, if you're fat, you're fat. But even so, there's that concept of saying you're looking a little fatter, which can be a little bit of a compliment, right?
A compliment? I don't know, like maybe in some cases, but I think the thing to remember is that when it comes to physical appearance, the Chinese tend to be a lot more objective. Like in American culture, you never say anyone's not pretty or, no one is fat, right? But in China, it's like, well, if most people would consider you fat, then you're fat. And if most people wouldn't say you're really attractive, then you're not attractive. And like, that's how it is.
And I will say the Chinese standards of fat are usually not the Western standards of fat. So it's like, even if you're a little overweight, they might say, yeah, you're fat. And I will say that on the compliment thing, it does depend on the context. I mean, kids that are kind of growing up, they're like, oh, they're a little fatter, That's also kind of a good thing, Or if you were really skinny and, you're kind of like, working out now and you're maybe, putting a little muscle, they could say, oh, you're looking a little fatter, that could be a positive thing.
Well, there are other words besides fat to say that you're gaining muscle, but anyway, they're not trying to be mean a lot of the time. They're just kind of making conversation. And obviously some people are a bit slicker, and maybe they realize that foreigners don't like that, so they're going to be, nicer in your mind, whereas other people are just going to be kind of blunt and call it like they see it, and they're not necessarily being rude. They're just, being very straightforward.
That's very accurate. So, yeah, just being realistic, straightforward. It's not really judgmental. I think that's a key thing. It's not really judgmental. It's just more like observation of a fact, how they're seeing it, and just maybe even the words that they're saying. So, yeah, not necessarily being rude, direct.
All right, now here's the interesting thing. We were just talking about them being direct. Now, what I want to talk about next is how sometimes we foreigners are perceived as rude by the Chinese and how that happens. And I was talking to my All-Set Learning teachers about this, and one of the things they both mentioned when we had this conversation, was that often foreigners are too direct. And I think this is partly because, they talk to a lot of learners in Chinese. And when your Chinese is still at the elementary or intermediate level, then sometimes you're not going to be, the most smooth talking. But I think it's also a cultural thing about sometimes foreigners being a bit more direct.
Full of contradictions here, aren't we, John?
We love it.
One of these that can be a big no-no in Chinese culture is criticizing publicly. So this is like one-on-one, maybe you don't like something or you don't agree with the idea. You can address that. There are some things you should be, ways that were better to approach it than others. But one thing that does not go over well is like you're in a meeting, your boss says something, and maybe it's wrong even, or it's factually incorrect or something, and then being like, raising your hand or something like, that's not true, or actually the data says this, or whatever. Just like publicly like criticizing someone does not usually go over well with other Chinese speakers.
Yeah, and all your coworkers are just cringing because everyone knew it was wrong, and you're the only one that felt the need to say something.
So that does not go well for job relations and all that other stuff. But yeah, usually there's better ways to handle that. The common way in Chinese culture is like, all right, just hold your tongue. After the meeting, you could go talk to your boss privately and approach it in a very diplomatic way.
So I think that foreigners are sometimes perceived as a little rude because we say so little. Like if your Chinese isn't great and you're having a WeChat conversation, you might give a very short reply. And sometimes because people don't get your tone of voice over text, it might come across as a little curt. And that's not something you can worry about too much. I mean, it's going to happen even in your native language occasionally. But even on WeChat, sometimes it's kind of funny. The little smiley emoji, just the regular smile, is actually considered a little bit rude by today's, like the younger generations, because it's kind of like saying that's nice as a reply, just like a very, patronizing.
Yes. It's with the variety of emojis that are available. Don't use the vanilla one, right? Get a little more one that's precise about what you're really trying to convey, right?
Yeah, if it's the joyful one with the little like smiling eyes, or the one with the big like laughing mouth, those are considered more genuine than just the very generic smile, which could be a fake smile.
That's good to know, John. I don't think I was fully aware of that. But now that I think about it, a lot of the emojis that you might see on Chinese chat platforms, they are, I would say, more exaggerated perhaps than other emojis that we have access to here in the Western world. Some of them are really cute, though. I do like them.
I think one thing that might sometimes happen is, a very hospitable Chinese host might take a foreigner out to eat, and they're doing their best, but they really don't realize that some foods are considered quite unappetizing by Westerners. And if you're a very polite Westerner and you can like choke down, the chicken feet or whatever it is you don't want to eat, then you're okay. But some people, they might get invited to some lavish banquet and they're just like, no, I'm vegetarian. I'm not going to eat any of this. And sorry, I don't mean to dump on vegetarians here. But depending on how you react to the situation, that could go over very badly.
I got to say, John, I usually don't have this issue because I'll eat anything. But yeah, it's one of the things sometimes, this isn't exclusive to Chinese culture, of course, but, eating the food shows, I guess, appreciation and some gratitude, and not eating it or just eating like scant portions can be perceived as being rude. And John, I think one of the last ones to bring up here is about, sometimes how foreigners can be perceived as rude is about this concept of, one way we can phrase it here is returning favors, but the other term I would refer to is this guanxi, right? Which is translated sometimes as relationships. Frequently, you may find that people might do a favor for you, or they might buy you a treat, or they might do something nice for you in some way. And you'd be like, oh, that's really nice. That's polite. And it is polite and it is nice, but there is kind of an underlying concept in Chinese culture of that, yes, it's polite, but there is some sort of informal mental ledger there, right? Where they kind of did a favor for you, and at some point they may ask you for a favor. And when that comes due, you should kind of do your part and do something to help them out as well.
Yeah, so reciprocity, right? And to give an example, which is totally fake and probably not very credible, like what if your Chinese friend helps you move, and then like a couple months later they're like, my son's applying to Harvard, can you help him get in? And of course the answer is no, I can't help him get into Harvard. I don't know anyone at Harvard. Why would you even think that, right? But the point is they're asking you for a favor and they helped you before. So you can't just be like, no, because that seems really rude. And so you're going to have to do something. You're going to have to put in a little more effort to make them understand that you want to help them, but maybe this isn't something that you can help with.
I've had some instances before, John, a little bit like that, of where someone, they did a few favors for me, just totally, out of the blue. They brought me a present or a gift or something like that. And then like a week later, they asked me for a favor. And so that could be, that may not be uncommon. And I know that's not uncommon just for me, right? And it's okay. I think, in the Western world, at least for me, it's kind of like, I'd be happy to help you regardless. You don't have to do something for me. You could just come and ask me for help, and I'm happy to help you. But this is a little bit more of that cultural thing. And as you're putting out there, John, be helpful, especially if someone is trying to help you, or they're trying to do some things for you. They're perhaps maybe wanting to ask for a favor at some point, or there might be something down the line where they might want to cash in a chip, and that's okay. That's one of the cultural aspects of Chinese, and that's how we can make sure that we are also being culturally sensitive and not being rude as foreigners to native Chinese.
But the place that it becomes a linguistic issue is where they ask you for a favor, not realizing that like there's no way you can do that, and the way you reply, if you're not careful, could come across as super rude. It's like, I helped you, and then you just like totally refuse me when I just asked for this little thing. So you need to be conscious of that, that they might not be totally clear what they're asking or what your abilities are.
So I'm bringing this all together, Chinese, it's obviously very different language, and even though this is one of the things we always talk about, right, John, is that even though you may be able to translate something directly, that doesn't necessarily mean the meaning is fully conveyed. And recognizing that when, some of these cultural things that are baked into the language and how people are using it to communicate with you doesn't necessarily mean that they're trying to be rude. And the same thing is that being sensitive to some of these aspects so that when we're trying to communicate back to other Chinese natives that we are not being at least rude or being perceived as rude when we're trying to communicate.
But at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of fun. You will laugh, you will cry, you will be offended, but you will learn Chinese. That's
right. You'll learn Chinese. And I will say the last thing on this, John, sometimes you can just pull the foreigner pass, right? You're going to be like, oh, I'm sorry. I'm a foreigner. I didn't realize this, or you can say, "Doibuchi," right?
And you're like, I'm a foreigner. I'm dumb.
And
I just don't know things.
And that's correct. You are a dumb foreigner.
You have much to learn.
That's right. All right, now it's time for a word from our sponsor. And today our sponsor is
Mandarin Companion Chinese Graded Readers.
Today we're talking about In Search of Huama.
Huama is the Chinese name of this story. It is an original story, and you can read it with only 150 basic characters under your belt.
I really enjoyed this story, John. It's a little bit more akin to like Alice in Wonderland. But some boy, he wants to get a present for his mother for her birthday. He ends up traveling through the mountains, and he ends up walking through the mountains in search of some flowers and comes across an old lady and goes into her home, and he's magically transported to a different part of China, and he's on a quest to find Huama.
Yeah, so this is a fantasy story. We don't have a ton of those, but this is one of them. It's a good one. And just to illustrate how simple the characters are, the name Huama is flower horse. So if you know those two characters, you might be able to read this story.
You can definitely read the title. So go out there and get it today. In Search of Huama. You can find it on Amazon, iBooks, Kobo, or wherever you get your books. All right, now it's time for rants and raves. John, what do you have for us today? Do you have a rant or do you have a rave?
I have a rave today. It's a very simple rave. I wanted to talk about a certain fruit, but I talked about it 3 years ago on this podcast, apparently, so I can't do that one. But there's a vegetable I wanted to mention. It is lotus root. This is something I had never eaten before coming to China. And I gotta stick a rant as part of this rave. So there's this one kind of lotus root where they stick like glutinous rice in it, and they like drizzle it in honey, and it's like all sweet. I do not like that one. But then there's this other one.
That's good stuff.
I don't like it. There's this other one. It's stir fried. It's salty and spicy, like pretty spicy. Like that one is good. And anyway, lotus root is just one of many vegetables that I learned to like that I had never eaten in the U.S. I learned to like after coming to China. It's awesome.
Well, sometimes you can get that for hot pot too, right?
Yeah, it's good.
Lotus root's good stuff. I like it all. I like it all, John.
So maybe now isn't the time, but people, when you can, you got to come to China, and there's lots of cool stuff to eat. All right, so Jared, do you have a rant or a rave?
John, today I have a rave.
All right.
You ready to hear it?
Yep.
Okay, all right. So I guess this is a personal one. This is some personal in our family. My son he's been in a Chinese dual immersion, Miles, and he just took the AP Chinese exam a couple months ago at the end of the school year. And we just found out this week he passed. Yay! So a shout out to my son Miles for passing the AP Chinese exam, and I'm glad he did it.
Good job, Miles. You can learn Chinese too.
He can. And I kind of told him, I says, dude, if you don't pass this is going to be like, I'm going to lose massive face. So no pressure. So
you probably told him that if he didn't pass, you were going to do a rant on your podcast about how he didn't pass, right?
Probably. But instead, I got to do a rave. No, I wouldn't have.
Yay!
At least not that bad, at least. But anyway, so shout out to Miles and anyone out there who passed the AP Chinese exam. This is for high school students here in America. That's a Chinese language proficiency exam. So congratulations to anyone who passed it out there. And if you didn't pass it and you're listening, then get in there. You could do it next year. So, but hey, I'm proud of Miles. for all the work he did, and he got that done. So you can learn Chinese, and you can pass Chinese exams too, probably.
Yay.
My name is Randy Telfer, or Randall, depending where you are in the world and whether or not you are a fan of Austin Powers. I'm originally from Connecticut, and I've been studying Chinese since I was a teenager, and now I'm in DC doing research on China.
While Randy is very modest, as you listen to his story, it becomes quite apparent that his Chinese skills are top-notch. What stood out to me is how his focus and interests help him develop his talents and propel his language ability to new heights. Stay with us. All right, Randy, why did you start learning Chinese?
I think the spark of motivation to learn Chinese started in childhood when I was about 6 years old. My mother wanted to learn how to defend her two sons and herself, and she had me tag along. And we ended up studying a form of Okinawan martial arts, but it traces its roots back to Fujian province.
Wow.
Our instructor incorporated some philosophical elements into his teaching, and I think that really resonated with me, even though I was 6 years old. I wanted to learn more about it, but through the language itself. And I think the curiosity started then, but it wasn't until I was a teenager that spark set flame, and I became infatuated with Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee films. And in middle school, I would film fight scenes with my friends, and I had this dream of joining the Chengjiaban, the Jackie Chan stunt team.
Oh, wow.
And figured that my inferior martial arts skills could maybe somehow be compensated by some knowledge of Chinese. And little did I know that the late and very great Brad Allen had already done that. He was from Australia.
Oh, Brad Allen, I'm familiar with this guy.
Yeah, he passed away recently. He was, I believe, a stunt coordinator for the Shang-Chi film. I don't know if that's Universal or Marvel, or I'm showing my ignorance. But
And Legend of the Ten Rings. Excellent movie, by the way.
yes, he did some work on that, and you can really tell visually that he was on the Jackie Chan stunt team. There's a lot of stunts and fight coordination in that movie that is very reminiscent of Jackie Chan's films.
I can see you know a lot about this. I certainly would have picked that up, despite loving Jackie Chan movies. So, but that's amazing. I mean, you really got into, I guess, the martial arts side of it, and then I guess the philosophy. And then, what point did that cross over into say, "Hey, I want to learn Chinese. I'm going to do this"?
I think the more I learned about Chinese, the more curious I became about it, and the martial arts remained an important part of my life, but more as a way to keep fit and to defend myself and others. But I just became very curious about Chinese and wanted to learn more, and that became more of the passion, and I wanted to do something with that.
So did you have the opportunity to take like a Chinese class or in high school, or when did that actually okay, I'm buckling down, I'm going to start learning this language? When did that happen?
The resources were scarce in rural New England in the early to mid 2000s before Chinese really caught on as a popular language to learn. I kind of tried to do some self-study in the foreign language section of a local bookstore, but I didn't get very far with that. You can't teach yourself a language like that by reading grammar books, and so that didn't work. And then I tried Chinese school on Sunday at a local university, and unfortunately that didn't work for me either because most of my classmates were heritage learners and they spoke Chinese at home. And so I remember that first class I went to, it might have been the only one, we were reading 西游记.
Oh, my.
And I didn't even know how to say what time it was. So
Journey to the West.
Yes.
So you were in that weekend class for the Chinese heritage learners, right? I have yet to meet a heritage learner that didn't attend those weekend classes.
Yeah, so it was very challenging for me because I couldn't figure out how to learn this language and where to go. But finally, I met this accountant, actually. She's from Beijing, and she taught Chinese part-time. And I kind of learned how she had learned in a way, just without the language environment of growing up in Beijing. So she gave me her yuwen textbooks, so the books that she used when she was in elementary school. And so she would read them with me. So I learned words like 蒲公英, the word for dandelion, before I learned how to ask what time it was.
Well, I didn't even know that one, so...
Yeah, it was very strange, like the sequencing of all this. And so around that time as well, I had a friend, an exchange student from Taipei, and I got to speak Chinese with him on a daily basis. I'm dating myself, but we would listen to J-Cho CDs together, and that's really when my speaking and listening kind of improved. I started to learn conversational phrases rather than things like dandelions. And I also had some exposure to traditional characters in addition to the simplified characters I was learning just by chatting with my friend from Taipei on, again, dating myself, MSN Messenger, which I don't think exists anymore.
That's really interesting. So you had like a smattering of ways that you were trying to learn, but it would have been really easy to give up after that first or even second attempt. Heck, I imagine going to that class with the heritage learners, I might have said, I'm never going to get there. What kept you going, though? Why did you decide, despite the difficulty, I'm going to stick with this and I'm going to keep trying to learn?
You're absolutely right. It was very frustrating, and I considered quitting several times, especially when my teacher would give me this 听写 test. Mm-hmm. She would recite something and have me write it out. And I wasn't able to recall the character, 提笔忘字, it's called. You lift the pen and you forget the character. And I was relying on rote memorization, and I didn't really understand structurally how the writing system worked. And I would ask her about it, and it was on the tip of her tongue, but she couldn't quite express it. And I just really wanted to figure it out. And I think that's what kept me going. This has to make sense. Let me just make sense of it. And I think it got to a point where I needed to formalize my study.
That's interesting to me. So it sounds like the challenge, right? The challenge of saying, hey, I can learn this if I try hard enough, perhaps?
Every language has some structure to it. At least that's what I had in my mind. Like, this has to make sense. Like, people have learned this language before. It's not some insurmountable mountain. I should be able to figure this out. And I think it was ultimately the curiosity that kept me going. What little I knew about how Chinese characters were put together, it was very interesting to me, and I wanted to learn more, I think.
What was interesting about it? I mean, you mentioned the characters, but thinking about it, what was really drawing you in then?
I think the etymology of the characters was interesting. Also, just the fact that Mandarin Chinese is a tonal language. I thought it was very interesting how the slight inflection or the change in tone of your voice can change the meaning of what you're saying. Being in that bookstore in the foreign language reference section and flipping through the dictionary and looking at 好, good, and seeing the entries above and below it. So 好, and seeing all the different words. And I remember looking at 好, so like a character that's used to refer to an oyster. I actually worked at a Chinese restaurant around that time, and I knew the word for oil. And about a year or so after that, I was in China for the first time, and someone else on the trip had a seafood allergy, and she ate something and began to have an allergic reaction to it. And we needed to figure out what was in it that gave her that allergic reaction. And I just turned to the waiter who happened to be there trying to figure out what was going on himself. And I asked him, is there oyster sauce in this? And I just happened to know how to say that because I had pieced those two things together. But yeah, things like that.
That's amazing. You always say, learn things that are relevant to you, but sometimes there are things that are going to be relevant only when they are. And that sounds like one of those instances.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm also thinking, learning from kids' textbooks for native kids, like a first grader, second grader, that's not easy. But it sounds like you made some progress. I mean, heck, right now you're even able to recall the word for dandelion, things like that. And you even got to a point, hey, you had someone to talk to, and you were able to talk to them on MSN chat. So it sounds to me like you maybe not having the most optimal learning methods, but you were making some progress and you were learning.
I don't know if listeners might be familiar with the phrase 学以致用, so to study for the purpose of application. And I would add to that, trying to study through experiencing the language. I have a mentor. I don't know if you're familiar with Cornelius Kubler at Williams College. He's a linguist and he studies Chinese dialectology, especially dialects, Minnan dialects. I learned this phrase from him, kind of this fact versus act, or it's also known as education versus training, or academic learning versus experiential learning. And I feel that a lot of my learning at those beginning stages were experiential learning. I was kind of learning through experiencing things. And I think that is a very good way to learn, because I guess you can't fit everything you absolutely need to know into a textbook. And so there might be students whose entry point was slightly different. They started through formal study, whereas I started through this experiential learning. Maybe they had a more structured approach, but there were cultural references or things like that that they might not have been familiar with when they encountered them in a Chinese language speaking environment.
That's really interesting, Randy. So what kind of happened here? You started getting some Chinese proficiency. I try to avoid the F word, fluency, right? Versus now, like Chinese is a big part of your life, right? Your job centers around Chinese, and you've done years of education, if you will, in Chinese. What kind of bridged that gap from saying, okay, this is just an interest and a hobby versus, hey, I really want to focus on learning this language?
I think it stemmed from the frustration of not being able to understand structurally how the writing system worked. And so eventually I was able to meet a Chinese language lecturer at a local university who taught Chinese to university students. And I think that marked the start of my formal study, and I got more serious about it. It's what I did on the weekends. My high school classmates, they would go to the movies and go to football games on the weekends, and I would go to my teacher's house and read Chinese articles with my teacher out loud. Her mother would come to her house and live with her over the summers. And I remember that first summer I was studying with her, my Chinese teacher's mother, I called her La La later when I actually met her. But I would have my lessons in the dining room, and little did I know that La La was in the kitchen listening.
Oh, wow.
And after each lesson, I would leave, and La La would say to my teacher, oh, that student, he sounds very serious. He really wants to learn. He's very enthusiastic. Why doesn't he live with us in Beijing whenever he has the chance to go to China? And she happened to live in a traditional hutong, like the...
Wow. For listeners, hutong is kind of like an alleyway. The city blocks in Beijing, they're very large, and they got little hutongs or, alleyways that go through them. Anyway.
Yeah, and so I lived with her for a summer and her grandson, and really got to appreciate the humor that thrives in Beijing dialect, took formal classes, and kind of went from there.
Did you go to Beijing to stay with them?
I did. So I had been to Beijing once before that. The oyster sauce story, that was the first time I was in China. That was in the summer of 2006. And so after that, I met I would consider her my 启蒙老师, my very first formal Chinese teacher. After my first time in China, I went again in the summer of 2007. And that's when I went to BLCU, Beijing Language and Culture University, for a summer. And that's when I lived with them in the hutong, yes.
Wow, that's really neat. Well, tell me about that first time going to China. You saved one of your classmates' lives by, I correctly identifying their oyster sauce, right? That's amazing. So that's a big win there. I mean, but what was that like? It sounds like you were having a lot of language practice before you went, but what was it like being in the country the first time?
I remember being on that plane for 13 or 14 hours and just staring at the back of the seat in front of me with excitement. I just couldn't wait. I think living and growing up in rural Connecticut, New England, I didn't really have that language environment. I was craving for that immersion that I didn't have. So to make up for that, I would try to surround myself with the language as much as I could before I went. Writing grocery lists in Chinese, writing class notes in Chinese. If something would take up less space on the paper for whatever class I was taking notes on, I would write it in Chinese. Or the operating system of my computer was in Chinese, just so I was looking at it every day. And getting off of that plane and finally just seeing signs in Chinese and having that immersive language environment, I was so excited and ready to absorb everything.
Perception versus reality, right? Like, there's many people, they're studying for years. All right, I'm going to go to China. But there's difficult parts, right? But what was your experience?
I like to believe that people have different personalities in different languages. So in English, I am very shy. I struggle to come up with words and express myself and figure out what I want to say. I have what I want to say in my mind, but it just doesn't come out very fluidly in English. I can't say that it does in Chinese, but I feel like my personality is slightly different in Chinese. I'm just a little bit more outgoing and willing to take those risks in Chinese. And I felt that finally arriving in China, I was just ready to unravel and just go and make mistakes and learn as much as I could.
I think something that I'd like to hear from your perspective, and John, I call John a high-functioning introvert, but you sound a little bit like maybe along those lines too. Hey, you say it's a little maybe harder for you to express yourself. Maybe you're feeling a little more shy, but a lot of people out there feel that same way. What advice would you give to people who feel that same way when you're trying to learn and practice Chinese? Because, practicing a language, you got to get out there, you have to speak, and you got to make mistakes, and you got to be okay with making mistakes. So what kind of worked for you, and what advice would you give to people who struggle with the same things?
I think I would cite something that a Chinese teacher had said to me, which was 脸皮厚一点才能学好语言. Like, your skin has to be thick in order to learn a language well. If you're afraid of making mistakes, that will impede your progress. And once you are able to let go of that fear of making mistakes, that's when the real progress will start. And I tried to do that as much as I could. Again, going back to being very introverted and terrified of speaking in front of other people, let alone singing. I remember in Beijing, there was this guy fishing in a park, and he was whistling, and I recognized the tune, and I just sang along with him. And I remember him getting the gist of what he was saying, which was, I have never interacted with an American before, and I didn't really have an impression of what American people were like, but I think I like Americans now, or something along those lines. And just realizing that through this language study and being a foreigner and coming to a target language country, and I guess just realizing that through language study, being a foreigner speaking Chinese in China, there's this ability to diffuse situations. So walking around in China, especially in those days, I sound really old saying that, not everybody expects foreigners to speak Chinese, and they might assume that you don't. And I remember walking into a bank in Wuhan when I was working in Wuhan. There was a section of the bank that was closed because it was undergoing renovation. I remember a staff member running out and latching onto my arm and just trying to figure out how to express this to me in English, not knowing that I could speak Chinese. And I just said, what's going on in Chinese or something like that. And immediately their grip on my arm just let go, and there's, sorry, we're undergoing a renovation. You can't withdraw money here. For some reason, all of this happened at banks.
Yeah.
I remember going to a bank to make a deposit, and there was one of those armored trucks, and there was this guy with a shotgun. Mm-hmm. And he's holding his shotgun, and we establish eye contact. He sees the American approaching the bank, and he's like, haha, I'm the one with the gun. He's not saying anything, but the way he gripped his gun and he smirked at me, I could tell that's what he was thinking. And I forget what I said to him, but using Chinese in that situation completely diffused the situation. I think I might have said something along the lines of, hey, I'm American, but I don't have a gun. My family doesn't have guns, or something along those lines. And he immediately just started laughing. And, there was the tension in that situation was gone.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And I like how you were bringing up that idea of having another personality in Chinese. And I felt that too. It's like sometimes, that other personality, it's almost like it's okay for that one not to be perfect. It's okay. This one, it's like your alter ego a little bit, right? And this one can be a little more outgoing, whatever it needs.
Right.
Then in order to learn, you can let that be that way.
Right.
Now, I know you studied at the Hopkins Nanjing Center. It's sponsored by Johns Hopkins University, right? I don't know lots about it, but I know it's a rather intense course for people who are really pursuing a high level of proficiency in Chinese. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that experience too, and about some of the opportunities that's opened up for you.
What's great about the Hopkins Nanjing Center is you have people from all walks of life coming into this small part of the Nanjing University campus. You have advanced learners of Chinese, some learners of Chinese who are newer and are extremely courageous, and they're accepting the challenge of taking graduate courses in Chinese despite being relatively new to the language. You have heritage learners, you have non-heritage learners, you have students from the US, you have students from China, you have students from other countries in the world, and they're all together at the HNC. And it's just this incredible place. It's on this little tiny postage stamp within Nanjing, this little campus, but it has so much within those campus doors. Just the level of linguistic and cultural exchange that goes on, people to people, classmate to classmate, or classmate to professor, exchanges that go on. It's a really unique place. And what's great about it is HNC students get to study in their target language. So students studying international relations, for example. So HNC students can study subject matter in their target language. So me, for example, not being a native speaker of Chinese, I was able to study international relations in Chinese. And my Chinese classmates were able to learn international relations in English.
Wow, that's great. So the Nanjing Center, it sounds like you can really get some targeted instruction, not just in Chinese, but in a specific area of interest.
Right. So it's not strictly a language program, but you get to learn your subject matter of interest in your target language. So there were students studying international affairs in Chinese. There were Chinese students studying environmental studies or energy and resources in English. There were students studying international law in their target language, all kinds of things. So the possibilities are endless. If you're a Chinese student at the HNC, you have this specialized knowledge in your target language of English, and you can go on and do brilliant things with that. Not only do you have general language skills, but you have specialized language skills that I think would come in handy. And that's the case for the students at the HNC studying Chinese as well. So the professors at HNC, they don't necessarily care about your language level. They're not going to correct your grammar unless it's incoherent writing that you're giving them for your writing assignments. But the focus is more on communicating effectively. Can you express yourself in your target language? Can you make yourself understood? And that's kind of what the HNC is all about, this mutual understanding between China and the US and other students from other countries.
That's really interesting. That sounds like a really great opportunity. What kind of career opportunities has all of this opened up for you?
Yeah, especially for people that are looking to put their Chinese language skills to use in a full-time job. It depends on the field. So like international relations, a lot of employers are looking for people who are able to conduct research and be able to conduct that research in the target language, be able to kind of get deeper than knee-deep in primary sources, have a certain level of comfort reading Chinese newspapers and whatnot. And so a lot of employers by default are looking for that master's degree. And so being able to check off that box, and going back to that phrase I used about the thickness of one's skin, my skin being slightly thicker coming out of that program went a long way.
That makes a lot of sense. So, Randy, I also know that you did work for Chung & Sui. Now, people may not know that name as well, but many people are more familiar with Integrated Chinese, the textbook, right? And so what was it like working for a publisher of educational books in Chinese?
It was a lot of fun. I was the only non-native speaking editor at the time. Now there are several. But I was able to bring that perspective of a Chinese language learner. And all the crazy different kinds of exposure I had to different kinds of Chinese, so working in a Chinese restaurant and having exposure to Cantonese, having that friend from Taipei in high school and having that exposure to Mandarin as it's spoken in Taiwan, and having lived in Wuhan and just living and experiencing the language, bringing that perspective I think was helpful. Because when I was editing manuscripts, I wasn't learning the grammar points for the first time in those pages, but I could draw on experience as to what sounded natural and why you can't say something a certain way. I think John's Chinese grammar wikis do a great job with those explanations, because we would get a lot of readers writing to us saying, hey, I don't understand this grammar point. It says that you have to use it this way, but why? And kind of being able to draw on that experience was helpful. It was a great experience. It really sharpened editorial skills that I'm able to use in my job as a researcher now. I don't know if I can say this, but it was kind of amusing to correct the mistakes of these authors in Chinese. So I remember, I don't know if I can say this and have it. I think maybe what was most rewarding about it was this, is bringing that perspective of a Chinese language learner to that table and kind of being intimidated at first with being the only non-native speaker in the editorial group and kind of wondering to myself, what am I doing here? Who am I to say that I can edit Chinese language textbooks? That sounds ridiculous. I'm not a native speaker. But being able to draw on my experiences, exposure to traditional characters, for example. So just for efficiency, a lot of these manuscripts are typically written in English and in Chinese. The Chinese is in simplified characters. And what happens near the end of the process is those Chinese characters, they're automatically converted from simplified to traditional, but that can create some problems. So
we've had that same problem at Mandarin Companion.
Oh, you have?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's times where like maybe 3 traditional characters were combined into one simplified version.
Yes, there's that. And I remember this opening chapter of one of the books we were editing. They were talking about the structure of this one character, but they were referring to the character as it appears in simplified characters. And in traditional, what they were saying was no longer applicable. And I happened to be the editor that picked up on that. And it was really rewarding to be like, hey, I'm a non-native speaker of Chinese, but everyone sees things differently. Everyone reads or approaches a text differently. That was rewarding. It's like, hey, 我这个中文不是白学的.
That's a nice feather in the cap. So, Randy, one thing that's really apparent to me is that you've like really applied yourself to learning Chinese, and it's a big part of your life. I mean, what advice would you give to someone who really wants to learn this language and to achieve a high level of proficiency?
I think, like you said, you just have to make it a big part of your life in order to internalize the language. So I think back to those anecdotes I was sharing with you earlier about being a beginner and struggling to find resources and struggling to get that practice in. So in rural Connecticut, I remember we had a principal from Shandong province come visit our school, and no one could translate for him. And our school's principal was scrambling to find someone to translate, and I ended up being the one to try to translate. I was nowhere near an appropriate level to be translating what he was saying, but just...
I mean, you even attempted at those early stages, but I guess that probably showed you to a degree, hey, maybe I can do this.
Right. Getting yourself out of that comfort zone, forcing yourself. So if you find yourself in a place in the world where Chinese is not spoken in the environment around you, kind of create some kind of constructed immersion, writing shopping lists in Chinese, class notes, change the settings on your phone so that you're looking at Chinese characters. Things like that, just constantly exposing yourself to the language. If you happen to find yourself in a target language environment, if you're lucky enough to have that authentic immersion, befriend and interact with locals. I think John had a Sinosplice post about finding people who are bored and just walk up to them and talk to them and just get as much practice as you can. Just make it a part of your life. It's easier said than done depending on what kind of language environment you're in, but you can get creative and have fun with it.
That's good advice. Well, Randy, if you could go back and you could redo any part of your language learning journey differently, what would you do differently and why?
That's an excellent question. I think if there was anything I can go back and change, I would have studied harder when I was younger and just learned as much as I could while I still had that young and spongy brain of mine as a middle and high schooler. I think at that time I had this dream of being like an interpreter or a translator, and now that I'm over 30, my brain no longer has that sponginess. And to begin with, I'm not someone who can speak on my feet. I can't do that in English, let alone Chinese, and I don't have that instinct almost. I can do it in writing. You know, as an editor, I can write things in either language, and that's fine. But if it's simultaneous interpretation or something, I have so much respect for people in that profession because of the speed at which they can change that channel and switch over from one to the other. And they're hearing the sentence in one language and they're formulating it in another almost instantly, or while the sentence is being spoken. That is something I cannot do, and I just wish that I studied a lot harder when I was younger so that I could try to get to that point. I would have loved to have been able to do that.
I can relate to that. I started learning Chinese when I was 30, so it's a different experience, right? And one thing I think about is that saying is that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time is right now.
Ah, yes. There's a phrase I go by as well. It's my WeChat quote. It's 日日行，不怕万里路，时时做，不怕事不成. So if you are walking every day, you're not afraid of, a long distance. If you're doing something constantly, you're not worried about being unable to finish it. Just keep at it, and you'll take a glance back and you'll see how far you've come.
Words of wisdom from a man who knows. Well, Randy, I really appreciate you being on the podcast, sharing your story and your insights and wisdom with all of us.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. I've been reading John's Sinosplice blog since I started learning Chinese, and being able to meet him and you in Boston all those years ago, it was the highlight of that year, and this is a highlight of this year. So thank you so much.
Well, awesome. Well, thanks, Randy.
Thanks very much.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, podcaster, author, runner, trainer, swimmer, lifeguard, first mate, and that one gal named Nellie. You can subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review so we know how we're doing. You can find us on Facebook and at mandarincompanion.com. Tag us on social media, #MandarinCompanion. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor is Kaiser Guo at SupChina, and interview editor is Dominic Edgley. And I'd like to thank our guest interview, Randy Telfer, and of course, thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Pasden. See you next time.